Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Your Spiritual Journey. This is Dr. Bob, and this is the space and the place where we talk about things important to your soul. Today's guest is actually someone who's been on the program before. She was episode 3, and that was quite a while ago. Patty DeMarco is someone I feel a special kinship to for a number of reasons, but one is that we were born just a day apart, and we're recording this in May. It won't broadcast in May, but this is our month, so I'm very pleased to have her with us today. She has had quite a journey, and there are some things that I know that I have been doing recently that would resonate with her. I have taken a few forest bathing experiences, and I took my son through one just a couple weeks ago, and that was at the Pittsburgh Botanical Gardens. So those of you in this area, if you're not familiar with those, they're out toward the airport, and I highly recommend a visit to them. Something else that I just did this past weekend was I was at the Northeast Reiki retreat up in the Adirondacks, and those are held at the Silver Bay YMCA, which is on Silver Bay, part of Lake George, and it's just beautiful country. But as I was walking the labyrinth up there and overlooking the lake, and just picture that kind of scenery in the Adirondacks, I also spent some time with my favorite tree. It happens to be a northern red maple, which is a bit carved out in the middle just by nature. No human carving involved, but you could actually lay back in that carved out piece of that tree and feel its embrace. And to feel the embrace of that tree and its energy, that's the third time I've visited that tree over the past 3 years, and it's a marvelous experience. So I tell you these things because if you haven't listened to episode 3, then you don't know about Patty DeMarco and her connection to nature. So I'm going to turn the mic over to her, ask her to just talk a little bit about her past journey, because it's in more detail in episode 3, but maybe just do a little recap, because she started out as a Catholic.
I've been recovering for a long time.
And she's gone through a few iterations of denominations and landed in a pretty comfortable place.
Yeah.
So, Patty, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Spiritually, I think I'm probably closest to being an animist, because I find that every living thing is connected to every other living thing. And if you can find your own connection to the large web of life of which we are one part, you really see your place in the natural world. Yeah. And I think that is what we have lost in our haste for progress and modernization and the faster, cheaper, better, race for things. And it's infinitely unsatisfying in the end. And some of the simplest joys, you just described one, having a close connection to a living tree. I have my own living trees in my backyard, which actually helped me heal when I was recovering from chemotherapy and cancer, because I would take my naps on the grass. I have 200-year-old pin oaks that frame my yard, and the roots below intersect as the leaves above intersect. Yeah. So you're sort of in between the soil and the sky connected by those trees. And to me, I could lie there in a summer afternoon and feel the energy of that force going from the sky to the ground and back. And it is a very tangible and definite feeling of connection. When you're trying not to move because everything hurts, the stillness brings you things that you wouldn't normally notice. Yeah. So when you're at grass level and it hasn't been mowed, you have bees visiting the clover, and you can see the individual trail of a bee as it goes from one thing to another and maybe flies over you. You can hear the little rustling of things moving in the leaves, the chipmunks, which are endlessly busy, the squirrels, which are even more endlessly busy above and below the trees, and all the birds coming and going. And you just really notice little things that you wouldn't normally.
Yeah.
And to me, that intimate observing is really part of what made me a biologist in the first place, is that I grew up with my grandmother in the little garden they had, was, I think, a 1/4 acre little slice in Mount Washington. Mm-hmm. And every square inch was planted to something. Even the walkways where the bricks were laid between the garden plots were planted with thyme and chamomile that, seeded in there. So when you walked on it, it was a fragrant experience. And even as a child, I learned to discern which bugs were okay and which ones you had to pull off and put into a jar of oil so they wouldn't eat the vegetables or the fruit. So noticing, and these are the flowers that are going to make zucchinis, and these are the ones you can fry,
Yeah.
And so identifying minute details of the plants and the animals around me was something that became ingrained in your observing skills from an early age. And I think that's why I became a biologist in the first place, just noticing and being engaged with, the actual natural world around me.
Yeah, I envy you that. I was at least able to download an app that allows me to identify every plant that I come across, and I love having that. But
Rachel Carson wrote about this in The Sense of Wonder, and she said it's better to feel than to know. That the experience of being in nature is more important than knowing the name of everything that you see.
Yeah.
And, she describes that in that book, and it is a wonderful book. I give it to everyone who has a child. Here, this is your present, The Sense of Wonder, and exploring the natural world with your child, even if you know nothing other than, isn't this interesting, and doesn't this smell wonderful, and aren't these beautiful, You don't really need to know the scientific name of everything to appreciate it,
Right. But it helped me know that my tree is is a northern red oak.
Yeah.
Because I was curious to know after 3 visits exactly what his name was.
If it's a special tree, you definitely want to know.
Yeah. There's something about you that has always fascinated me, and that is the intensity at which you live your life. And maybe intensity is the wrong word, the vibrancy at which you live your life. And it just makes me want to talk to people of a certain age and say, retirement isn't about doing nothing. Retirement is about doing everything that you ever wanted to do and didn't have time to do. And that's something, as I look at your busy calendar and your schedule and just see all of the things that you're doing and all of the things that you're accomplishing. And some might say you're driven.
It's true.
So what is it that motivates you, that keeps you going, that keeps you so passionate about what you're up to?
Well, I've tried retiring 3 times. Hasn't worked yet. I think it is a passion. I live on borrowed time. I've had 4 cancers, any one of which could have ended me. And so I feel an obligation to use every day to the fullest. I also feel that as a world, as a civilization, we're on borrowed time. And the window for dealing with our existential crises of climate change and global pollution and global loss of biodiversity is closing very fast. So I feel that everything I can do to reach people about the urgency of really addressing these major existential crises that are converging, and that have solutions. It is not a technology problem. We are not facing the need for some great silver bullet invention to save us. What we need is to recognize that our civilization is in peril from our own actions and take the moral choice to give survival to the next generation.
Yeah.
And to me, I have nieces and nephews and grandchildren and children that I really feel need and deserve a life that is viable on this planet. And that drives me every day.
Yeah.
That drives me. And it isn't a depressing driven. It's a knowledge that we have solutions. They work. If put into practice, it will make a difference, and rather quickly. But we have the last thrashings of the dinosaurs are mighty and fierce.
Yeah.
And getting the political will to overcome the objections of those who have a vested interest in keeping things the way they are and the way they were back in the 1920s is the challenge that we face on a global basis. You know, there are about 25 multinational corporations who are accountable to no one and who live only for profits of the next quarter after that. And that kind of attitude has suffused our entire way of seeing things. You know, and I've written about this. My most recent blog, which I posted late for Earth Day, Made in America and Made to Last, compared the period when, right after the first Earth Day in 1970, the entire body of environmental law was passed within 5 years in response to the surge of moral outrage at what we're doing to the Earth. It was dramatic at that time. I mean, rivers were catching on fire, you know.
Yeah.
And the first oil spill that was observed in Santa Barbara, right outside the UCLA camp, University of California campus at Santa Barbara, created these things we see every day and they just go right by. It's like, oh yeah, there's another one. We've become numb. And we've realized, you know, no lessons from the past. But when you get people to recognize their power of joined voices, the power of acting together, you can make laws change. And Reimagine Appalachia was one of those things. And I would like to talk about that a little bit.
Well, I know that we have on display here on YouTube your 2 books. But you do have a 3rd book due out.
It's at the printer. In August, it'll come out. And this was, I think, a spiritual journey of a region, not just a single person. In the late part of 2019, when there were 5 petrochemical facilities announced to be built in the Ohio River Valley, one of which is the Shell plant in Monaca, which is operating. People felt like that was not the fate they wanted to see for their children and their communities. We came together to think about what would we do if we were given $6 million in incentives. Well, you know, when you ask people, you know, what would you prefer? They had good ideas. And we did 45 listening sessions in the space of 18 months across 4 states. And, you know, that was Western Pennsylvania, Ohio, part of Kentucky, and part of West Virginia. And we listened to people who had been coal miners and we'd listened to people who'd been in communities where the company town had come apart and they were left with, opioid addiction and so forth. But when you talk to them, they really were excited about restoring the land. The land supported us for years and years and years before we started mining, and it can do so again if we heal the land and if we exercise our power to say we deserve a way forward. We deserve to have investment made in these communities that have been abandoned, and we deserve to have a future that isn't polluted and poisoned and making us sick.
Right.
And that to me was just so powerful. And so much of what was in the Reimagine Appalachia blueprint that we developed out of all those listening sessions actually became law in the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, which is, I think, the bipartisan infrastructure bill when it was finally passed. Those two pieces of legislation have been game changers for action on climate and for reinvesting in disinvested and disadvantaged communities deliberately. The policies that are in there, first of all, the incentives for renewable energy to be fixed in law for 10 years, it gives certainty to the investment market. Oh, this isn't going away. We're not going to have to fight for this every 2 years with the budget cycle. This is 10 years. We have time to rely on that and build something that takes a little while to advance, and you'll know that that's still there. That was really critical. The other one was to have the Environmental Justice 40 initiative that the White House put out go across all of these laws. As a condition of getting money from the federal government, you have to give something back to the community. We heard so many times from people who said, these companies come in here, they get all kinds of incentives to do things. They rip up the land, they poison the water, and they walk away or go bankrupt and leave us with medical bills and broken land and no way to fix it. Tax base eroded. You don't have the wherewithal to fix what they left as a mess. So one of the things people said, they need to clean up their mess.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be on the taxpayers when they've got the profits and the benefits that we have to clean up their mess. So amending the Abandoned Mine Lands Act so that it goes before 1977 and provides funds for the mining that was left untouched, from, the 1800s forward. We had no way to address that because there were no funds in the Mine Reclamation Act of 1977. So we had, I think, significant progress made. And of course, right now, Congress is trying to defund all of that.
Yeah.
So I live in fear and trepidation that it will all come unraveled. But to have it happen, the other thing that I felt was really important from listening was the rage, the suppressed frustration of people. We gave our lives to build this country. We mined the coal, we made the steel, we made what it is that made America great, the railroads, the buildings, the war machines, the automobiles. We made the raw materials that made that happen, and nobody thanked us and nobody cares. So I thank them and I care. And when you give voice to people who feel that they have been taken advantage of and abandoned, and you say, when you all stand together and stop fighting with each other over scraps, we can harness our entire congressional delegation, get them to stop fighting with each other and start fighting for us, things happen.
Yeah.
And it was a very empowering experience to have people stand up and say, I called my congressman, for the first time. Well, this is a good thing. You should call your congressman. He works for you. And just the concept that these people that are elected down there, they're not the ones in power. We have the power. The power is with the people, and they work for us. You have to remind them of that on a daily basis if necessary. Right. And we inundated the offices of the congressional delegation and anyone else who would listen. And actually, we had a number of congressional staff people in our working groups when we were writing the white papers. And so they were feeding them directly into the discussions on shaping those laws. And that's how it happens. You have to engage upfront in a very, you know, and it takes a lot of passion. I'm not the only one. I mean, there are dozens of people who are in this up to their elbows, you know, fighting every day. I mean, Amanda Woodrum and Dana Kuline and, you know, just, you know, Steve Herzenberg, Ted Bettner, all these people. And I think that we need to have more times when the voices of the people are actually the voices that are heard in the halls of Congress. When you hear just from, you know, organized lobbyists and experts, you don't get the passion of the people in their own words. And to me, that is the power of this whole thing is, you know, people really have a lot to offer if you ask them.
Yeah. You know. So the nature of this next book that's coming out, what's the message? And well, have you continued with your positive feelings about the future?
Yeah, I have actually. The book is called Reimagine Appalachia, Healing the Land and Empowering the People. And it's really the story of this process. It includes all the issue papers that were written to support the blueprint in one place, because they're right now only on a web page from an unincorporated organization. Some of them have already receded into the archives. And this needs to be preserved and captured as a process and as a product. And it was an edited work, so I had, I think, 19 authors.
Okay.
And herding 19 authors is something that took many, I don't know if you can see the gray hairs, but it was quite an adventure. I was in footnote hell for months, you know.
Yeah.
And then getting copyright releases for stuff, you know. I mean, I'm not experienced in this, so.
It sounds like a legal nightmare.
Well, it didn't need to be, but because I had no clue what I was doing, yeah, it was a little bit of a nightmare. My brother helped me, but I think the end result is that we will have a book out of Elsevier in Springer Nature. It is published in an internationally recognized publisher. It was peer-reviewed, which took forever. I lost 8 months waiting for peer reviews to come back. So I was so frustrated because I couldn't do anything until they'd finished that, you know. And then getting all of the, you know, just the formatting and everything into one style and one form for the publishers. You know, this is, when you're doing it yourself, you write it as you go. But when you're dealing with various authors, some of whom are not in the profession, you know, they're not academic. Putting it into something that is the proper format just takes forever. I did have an intern. I had Sophia Porco, who's at Dickinson College. She was wonderful. And, you know, she helped me create from Adobe into Word. So that things like that, and helping with the footnotes. I mean, you know, one paper had over 200 footnotes in it.
Oh my.
Yeah. And they were all just web pages, websites. And of course, that isn't, you need it in Chicago Manual of Style, so it needs author, title, the whole 9 yards. Looking those all up and putting them in the right format just took forever.
All right. So as you describe this, I can feel my audience cringing, saying, okay, that sounds like such an academic tome.
Yeah. That
it doesn't sound like something that I would want to read.
Oh, no, it has stories in it. At the beginning of each section are some excerpts from the listening sessions where you have people say things like, we don't want to be trained for jobs we don't want in places we don't want to go. We want to be able to work here where we are.
Yeah.
And things of that nature. I had a lot of, and the papers themselves are not all academically with footnotes. I mean, they have to be documented because they're documented to the listening sessions.
Right.
But for example, the Black Appalachia storytelling piece, it describes people who served as midwives before you could have doctors, you know, and they have stories of people who cultivated the land in times past, and they have a land acknowledgement from Pomai Shakman Yalalai, whom I think you've had here.
Yeah.
So believe me, there are lots of tales in here that are quite interesting,
So what is your hope in terms of an audience for this and the result of their response to it? And what are you thinking about? Like, I have to write this book because...
Well, I think just the documentation of the fact that when people come together with a common purpose, you can really change the laws. You really do have the power to make things better. And, as these laws have been implemented and people are beginning to see the effect, you're finding money coming into places where it never went before.
Yeah.
And you're finding people working together who never worked together before. And to me, it already has been successful because of that.
Uh-huh.
And this is kind of, to me, a sense of, okay, we need to document it historically, but it's also a testament to the power of people when they decide to work together and give voice to their needs and their ideas.
So does that mean that if people in other regions also read about this process and how this happened, that they can duplicate it?
Yes, this is an international publication. So it's going out on Springer Nature worldwide. It comes out of Berlin. And it's, okay, it is an academic press. Okay.
Yeah.
But I'm hoping that people who teach process and who teach about governance will see the impact of this kind of work.
Yeah.
And I know I presented this when it was in process at the United Nations Convergence, one of the climate convergences that was held in Frankfurt in 2022. I talked about the Reimagine Appalachia process, which wasn't ended yet at that time, and although the blueprint was finished. And there was a lot of interest in, well, how did you get people to come together, and what did you do to make them work together? And it wasn't like that. It started just by listening to people and giving credence to the input of people who were speaking from their lived experience. And to me, that is the value. And academics do not often go to lived experience as a source of, they want data, they want, measurements, they want to, especially scientists, you want something objective. But when you're looking at social movements and when you're looking at existential crises, where a lot of people don't really understand the gravity of the situation in a real way, if you can gather their lived experience and explain to them that there's a better way forward, and that if we can do some things together to shift the paradigm, you can have good jobs without having to get sick.
Yeah.
And that's a very powerful concept. And you can have good jobs without ruining the land forever.
Yeah.
And by repairing the land, you get good jobs. And then you have the option of having fertile ground again. And to me, that's a very empowering concept.
What's funny is you're talking about that, and the way that you're talking about it makes me think of your mother.
Oh my goodness!
And for those who didn't listen to episode 3, could you talk about your mother just a little bit and what she did?
My mother was a rebel. She was an early feminist before they were called such. She worked after being married. She was the organizer for students' rights for teachers. She organized the administrators in the Pittsburgh Public Schools, and she did her doctoral thesis for the magnet school concept. So she was in the diplomatic service as a hostess and cultural diplomat, really, in 6 or 7 different foreign countries. And she brought all of that to her teaching. And I still encounter her students sometimes, oh, yes, I knew your mother. And then we both cry. And, she was a very dynamic person, and she really empowered her students. I mean, she directed the class plays at South Hills High School, and they did Man of La Mancha, and they did West Side Story, which were very controversial subjects to bring up at a time when racial tensions were running high and the civil rights movement was rampant. And she used theater as a way to articulate tensions and help people resolve things. Yeah. She was one of the most empowering people I ever met. Very demanding on her own family. I was chief cook and bottle washer in the house for years because my mother was out running around, running meetings and holding union things and such. But, it was good for me. I mean, we developed a sense of independence and resilience that many children did not get.
Right.
And I unfortunately did the same to my own children.
Well, it sounds like you had quite a role model there.
I did. And, my kids both learned to speak pretty early because they were in part of the day, every day, they were in childcare. So they couldn't just whine and point. They had to be able to talk, to say things. And I've talked to them about this, and they said, yeah, I know. We had to make supper. And they tell me about some of the disasters I didn't even know about until later. But, they both cook. They both know how to organize a dinner party. They both know to organize events. They were dragged around public hearings.
Yeah.
And so they learned about all kinds of stuff. Yeah. And we did the same in my family. You're a participant in the family. You are a participant in the work of the household.
Yeah.
And some of that participation is supporting the basic functions while your mother is out giving speeches and running around doing union organizing. So I think, to me, I feel like I'm very much in my parents' tradition. I mean, they were change makers, and my father was a writer and a poet at heart, but didn't express it very much after the war. He was a very deep person.
Uh-huh.
And I would go to his lectures. He taught technical writing at Pitt in the engineering school. And because we were commuting together, I would go to at least the last part of his class, and we would go home together. I learned a lot listening to him talk about technical writing to the engineers. And, one thing that really stayed with me that was amusing a little bit at the time, he'd been making them read Thackeray and and they were trying to figure out, we're engineers, why do we need to read this stuff? And he said, okay, you're going to be spending a lot of your life writing proposals and writing out forms. He said, the schlemiel that gets your application is going to check off the boxes to make sure all the parts are there. But if you don't have a compelling first sentence, there's nothing that's going to make yours stand out from everything else.
Right.
And so they're looking at him like he's crazy. But I thought, that's really true. Because if you're turning in a grant application and there are like 1,300 applications and they're going to award 10, you've got to have something more than all the boxes checked.
Right.
You have to have a compelling story. Well, you can't write a compelling story if you've never read any. Mm-hmm. So he would have been horrified at today's students.
Yeah.
They give you stuff in text message mode. So I'm terrible to them. I make them write every week. At the third grammatical or spelling error, I draw a line and say, I stopped reading here. If you worked for me, you would be fired. I mean, what? You can't do this. I'm going, yeah, I can, because someday your well-being is going to depend on somebody reading through what you wrote.
Okay, for our audience sake who didn't listen to that first episode, what is your background, your academic background?
Okay, I have a doctorate in biology from the University of Pittsburgh and a postdoc at Yale and at the Boston University School of Medicine. I started out my academic career with an interest in environmental mutagens, And that's a field I never practiced because I had 2 children in quick succession and I fell off the tenure track.
Yeah.
And you never go back. So I found out that through being in the League of Women Voters, that there was a space for someone who could translate between the lawyers and the economists and the scientists on public policy matters. And I became engaged in the nuclear proliferation of power plants as a concern for the environment and concern for my children. Mm-hmm. And I found that there was a space for being able to communicate across that barrier. Yeah. And I found a career in that space, and I've been there forever.
But now you're also a teacher?
Yes, I teach at Chatham, and I taught at Pitt from 2007 to 2013, and then I shifted to just teaching at Chatham. Uh-huh. And I teach basically ethics in public policy. As a course, it's called Public Policy Decision Making, but basically it's bringing that moral component into the public policy process.
So how did you end up at the Rachel Carson homestead?
Well, okay. I had been in Alaska for 10 years, and I left under quite a bit of stressful duress. And so I came home. And I was looking around for a job, and I looked at a couple of different places, and then I realized the Rachel Carson Homestead was looking for an executive director. So I went up there and looked at it. It was pretty dilapidated, and it was closed. And I knocked on the door until somebody came down the stairs and let me in. I walked around it. It smelled like an old house, sort of musty. And I thought, well, Rachel Carson's house does not reflect Rachel Carson's message.
Yeah.
And I thought this might be interesting to do. And it was, I thought, non-controversial, pretty safe, out of the public eye. I left Alaska at a time when I had written a piece which ended up being the majority decision challenging the Trans-Alaska Pipeline tariff when I was commissioner. And I had my tires slashed. I had my mailbox pushed over. I had death threats. I left, under duress.
Yeah.
So I wanted a safe, uncontroversial place to come. And I ended up, being at the Rachel Carson Homestead for 5 years. I had a 5-year contract with them. And I was there during the 100th anniversary of her birth in 2007. So I had a year, little less than a year, to pull that together. And we did. We pulled it off. And then I worked on restoring the concept of Rachel Carson's environmental ethic, basically living in harmony with nature and preserving and protecting the natural world, which is our life support. And we did, I think, 6 Rachel Carson Legacy conferences, including having E.O. Wilson as the keynote speaker. And, it was a wonderful experience. The collaborations that I built with the help of Indira Nair, who was at that time at CMU, I believe, as the provost. We gathered people from all the universities and whatever industry was involved to come and pull those conferences together. And they were amazing, really wonderful. And at the end of that time, I went to Chatham to the Rachel Carson Institute for another 2 years. And we did the 50th anniversary of Silent Spring there. And I did a film with Mark Dixon called The Power of One Voice, which documented that conference at which her son spoke. So, I retired after that. In 2012, I thought I retired.
You thought you retired in 2012.
No, it didn't work. It didn't work at all. So, it's been an interesting journey.
Yeah. I want to steer the conversation back to politics a little bit. Mm-hmm. Just because you have been very politically active, and I know that you frequently host parties to fundraise, or at least to expose up-and-coming political figures who I imagine you support them because they are in line with
Yes.
with your basic ethic here. There are those in the political sphere who say climate change. Well, there's this wee little portion of climate change that's attributed to human action, and the rest of it is going to happen anyway. Ice ages come and go, and that's going to happen. Extinctions come and go, and that's going to happen, whether we do anything about it or not. So what's wrong with just doing nothing?
Well, you can do nothing, and the laws of nature are non-negotiable. So as the concentration of greenhouse gases continues to increase, the temperature of the earth will continue to warm, and it will become uninhabitable for warm-blooded creatures who require oxygen. And that is a foreseeable fate. We are already, in objective terms, observing the thermohaline circulation, which controls, it's the thermostat of the globe, the ocean thermohaline circulation. It is slowing down and fragmenting in measurable, statistically significant ways. This is not conjecture. This is documented, data-driven science. We have observed concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere of 425 parts per million as an average annual last year. That is, the last time that was observed was in the Pleistocene age. That continues going up, the acidification of the ocean, and it will become a stagnant pool the way it was in prehistoric times. And the oil and the gas and the coal that we're burning were partly formed by the algal sediment of those great, seas. The oxygen in the air ran up to 20% from all of those plants. And as they, died and fell into the bottom, those sediments folded under the pressure of time. They turned into the fossil fuel. So we're reversing in decades processes that took millions of years. And the laws of nature are not negotiable. You cannot pretend that it isn't there. When you add greenhouse gases that collect the heat, it's like putting blankets upon blankets upon blankets on something that's already warm. And so it becomes a suffocating situation. And I think if you look at the IPCC 6th Climate Assessment and the National Climate Assessment number 5 that came out last year, the data are very compelling. And people who don't believe in science or have discredited science and don't look at the actual facts, you can see around you, the seasons are shifting at different times. I was on an aviary expedition last weekend, and they commented that, the phasing of the insect emergence and the birds' return from migrations is getting out of sync. And the natural systems do not adapt in a short time to changes that are happening as rapidly as they are happening. And it isn't just the normal situation that we're seeing. If you take out volcanic action and sunspot action and, the El Nino effect, you still have, and I have a graph in some of the presentations I do that shows you this huge red blob, which is the human-caused combustion of fossil fuels. There's no question about it. It's people who have denied science. If you read the blog I wrote this month, I talk about how that happened as a deliberate undermining of science, starting with Ronald Reagan and going through both Bushes and especially Vice President Cheney. Really, the National Energy Act of 2005, where they empowered fracking by eliminating the 7 environmental and public health and safety and worker protection laws in order to allow fracking. I mean, it would, without that exemption or those exemptions, it would not be legal to do it. And gas is the future. The bridge to a disaster is what it is. So I feel frustrated that, if you talk to legislators, sometimes the last time they had science was in 5th grade, and people don't have credibility in science anymore. When I was growing up, if you were a scientist, you had, weight. And, if you could say this is the science. But scientists are partly to blame because they stay in their academic world and they talk to each other with increasing alarm. And they don't talk to the public about it, which is why, and you can't talk to the public in a way that they get depressed. You have to talk to people and say, look, we have solutions. We know they work. They work better. And if you start thinking about buildings as power plants, buildings that make more energy than they use on a regular basis, like our borough building. It's a borough building. Everybody who walks in there says, wow, this is cool. And there's a thing in the lobby that explains how it all works. So every person who gets in there has the opportunity to find out. And maybe now they can put it on their house because there's a 30% tax credit and there's all kinds of people to help you do this. And, incremental inches and inches. And when you're putting up low-income housing, for example, there's no reason you should not put up passive solar design buildings with photovoltaic on the roof and a heat pump. I mean, it would be cheaper to operate and it would be more comfortable and less polluting and more secure. And why in the world is government funding building anything but that? And I've been fighting over a national building code for passive solar design most of my life to no avail, because there are vested interests who would not appreciate that. But they're actually getting there. I mean, you should have some people on here to talk about that. Derek Tillman, for example, he builds passive solar design buildings, commercial and residential. They do very well.
Well, I have to say, as someone who for many years has lived in the community where you had some political clout and you had input into what was going on in the community in terms of energy. I'm thrilled and amazed at the progress that you made in Forest Hills. Could you talk about that a little bit and what's going on with
first of all,
generation?
It's a team effort, really, and you don't do these things alone. I came to the council when they were already in the middle of discussions about needing a new building, and they had hired an architect, Rob Foffman, who I worked with on the Rachel Carson house. So I knew him. So
you were familiar with each other.
I was really glad that he was there because he gets it. Okay. And we had 4 community charrettes around designing a new building. What do you want to see in the new building? The one we've had has been there since 1900-something. And it had originally been built as fire hall, where the horses were out the back. They converted it to a borough building. The heating and cooling system were just amazing. And the handicap accessibility was a serious impediment. Even though they had an elevator, it wasn't designed to proper standards. So if you went in the elevator in your wheelchair, you didn't have room to turn around and push the up button. You had to back in. And, it was a mess. And we did these charrettes. We got a lot of input from the public. And what was wise about this whole thing, and this was really a credit to the council that was there before I joined it, they decided how much they could spend. And they issued a bond for $4.8 million and put the rest of it into the capital budget. And they said, we can afford to spend $5 million on this building, period. Okay. And we've got that financed. We knew that's what we could do without raising taxes. Big issue with this, with the public. We do not want to raise taxes for a new building. What's wrong with the old building? It's perfectly fine. And So when we got all these charrettes, well, we were going to get rid of the library because the building was, the senior center and library was a mess, and they had consolidated 5 senior centers down to 3, and ours was one of the ones that got ditched, so the building had an empty. There was mold in it. It was no parking. It was dark. The library was in the basement. So, okay, we want to put the library in the new building. We need a better police function. The police function in the old building, you could film a 1920s movie there with no change of set. It was a disaster. So we got all this public input and sent the architect away. Came back with a design that was $7.5 million. We said, beautiful, lovely. This L-shaped building is absolutely gorgeous, but we can't afford an L-shaped building with 2 stories for $7.5 million. Sorry. He says, well, so we sent them away to value engineer 3 times. And they finally said, well, the only thing we can do is take off one of the bays and you'll lose the library. And then Senator Costa came in and said, no, here's what it would cost to put in the library, and here's a grant to do that. So we did that. So it came out to $5.2 million for everything. And we used a passive solar design, because if you orient the building with the long roof facing south, then you can have a much lower demand for electricity and much lower heating load, and it's more comfortable of a building all year round. We needed a zoning ordinance to be changed because the 3 corners, when it was diagonally on the lot instead of square to the corners, violated the zoning code, and they denied it. So we had to pass an ordinance to override the zoning and to allow passive solar design placement of a building on an empty lot. We put solar photovoltaic on the entire south-facing roof, and we used a geothermal earth tube system for the heating and cooling. And the building has been performing amazingly well from the beginning. At the end of March, we typically have $1,500 left from the prior summer. So okay. we're making more than we use on a regular basis. So the borough now has entered into a guaranteed energy savings program, which comes through the state Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. And they pre-qualify a whole list of providers, and we interviewed 4 of them and hired Siemens to do the engineering audits of all of our buildings and develop a scope of engineering based upgrades for energy efficiency and performance. And we have been, I'm now off of council, but they've continued implementing those measures. They're going to put solar on 4 more buildings.
Yeah.
And that will make the town pretty much carbon neutral for their energy operations in their own buildings. Yeah. So it's pretty exciting to do that. It is.
And, the concept is, the concept, as I understand it, is eventually the entire community will be contributing energy to the grid rather than taking energy from the grid.
Well, it goes 2 ways, and that's one of the problems. The grid is organized for a central power station to deliver power to the customers. When the customers start generating their own electricity and sending it back to the grid, you now have 2-way traffic.
Yeah.
And when the customers have decided that we're going to have a cluster of buildings that we would like to back up with our own battery for reliability purposes, for like the police and the fire and the emergency service, things which are all in one place, and we can get a battery that's made right here in Turtle Creek, the EOS Energy battery, it would make sense for reliability purposes to have that all backed up in a little microgrid.
Yeah.
Well, the difficulty is that we don't have an interconnection protocol for that. And there's no tariff that's really fair for that. So the system is not yet capable of 2-way traffic. And we're working on it. I mean, there are a lot of people working on it. In some places, they've made some solutions. The PPL system in the eastern part of our state has a tariff that they're experimenting with. It hasn't been declared a generic application for the whole state. And Pennsylvania is one of the least advanced in the promotion of renewable energy installations.
Yeah.
So we don't have like community virtual net metering, which would help a lot. And we don't have, for example, a tariff for people who generate and store power as well as use. So it's some of the things that, you know, the rules of the road are still being crafted.
Yeah.
And the regulatory infrastructure has not been adjusted for customer-based power. But if you look at on an objective basis, the concept of most buildings, certainly all new buildings, could be virtual power plants.
Right.
If you design them accordingly. And you interconnect them with smart technology to level the load where one is making more and others need. They do this in Frankfurt.
Yeah.
When I was there, I sat with their energy minister, and he explained to me the city was bombed flat except for the church. And when they rebuilt, they did passive solar design, and they put photovoltaic on all the roofs.
Yeah.
And they have them interconnected with artificial intelligence to keep the loads balanced. And they have some, you know, just generation on top of the train stations. Down the Autobahn, they have these big Y-shaped bifacial photovoltaic systems that are directly wired in through the underground. I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah.
So it isn't a technology problem. It's we've got to get the rules of the road straight. And right now there are a couple of plugs in the pipe that keep us from getting that to happen.
But your optimism says to me that it's going to happen. It's just
we just keep leaning. We just keep leaning on the plugs, and they'll give eventually. But I'm worried that we don't have time to, you know, delay indefinitely. Because every time you put up a new building that isn't an energy efficient building, or when they've bought the argument, oh, it's gas, it's clean, it's still a fossil fuel, and you're still burning it. So don't tell me it's clean. And when the way you get it is certainly not clean.
Yeah.
And I am gradually degasifying my entire house. I got rid of the stove, which was hard for me because I, you know, cooked on gas stoves all my life. But I've gotten used to the induction electric stove. It's pretty good. It works well. So.
Well, I had lots more we could talk about, but I know we're nearing the end of our time.
We are already.
I have to say, in the first interview, we talked about the intersection of both the science and the care for this planet, and the fact that a lot of religious traditions are now on board with that and very vociferous about it. At our church, Waverly Presbyterian Church, Sunday school class that my wife leads, so shout out to Amy.
Yes.
We're doing a program called Care for Creation.
Yes.
And this was developed by the presbytery. So we're very much on board with the need. And as you said, it's really critical that everybody get on board with this. So,
well, you know, it's your own life that you're preserving in the end, you know, because we depend on all of the interconnected little things you may not even know exist that provide the fertile soil and that provide the pollination. I mean, imagine if you had to artificially pollinate things. It would be millions and millions of dollars, and you couldn't possibly do it as efficiently as the insects. And I find that just the diversity of things that we share creation with is by itself a wonder, you know. And to me, if you can't appreciate the fact that you're part of a very complex web of life, you're really missing what it is to be alive. You know, and it is a marvel, it is a wonder, and it is a unique thing. I think there is a common spirit of the living earth that we can tap into. And I don't know, people describe a deity in different ways, but to me that is the universal deity, is the life force that vibrates throughout, all of the living systems, and we're all connected.
Right. Well, Patty, I think you're a strong example of the power of one voice.
Yes.
Is there anything else you'd like to leave our audience with in terms of a message before we sign off?
Well, just thank you. And thank you for everything you do and for reaching people with a message of hope and encouraging people to be part of the living world, to be aware of it and take the strength that comes from it.
So, audience, as always, take what you've heard and whatever resonates with you, put it into practice and put the rest on a shelf until you're ready to deal with it. And until next time, this has been your spiritual journey.